He lived in a large, modern house on the edge of the city, a place that looked perfect to anyone passing by. Everything was neat, polished, and organized. From the sparkling floors to the carefully arranged furniture, it was clear that he valued control and order. He liked to think of himself as a man who understood people, a man who could read others like an open book. Friends often joked about his sharp observations and quick judgments, and he took pride in it. But there was one person in his house he hadn't quite figured out yet. His maid. She had been working for him for a few years, quietly and efficiently. She never spoke more than necessary, never asked for special favors, and carried out every task with care. The house always smelled fresh, the kitchen was always clean, and the laundry was always folded perfectly. She did her work silently, without drawing attention to herself, and somehow managed to move through the house like she belonged there, yet wasn't a part of it. There was something calm and steady about her, something that made it difficult to pin her down. Over time, he began to notice small things about her that bothered him in a strange way. How she always seemed to anticipate what needed to be done before he even mentioned it. How she never lost her patience even when he grew impatient himself. And most of all, how she never seemed to flatter him or try to gain favor. That last one bothered him the most. He was used to people trying to impress him, to bending their words and actions to fit what they thought he wanted. She didn't do that. She simply worked and did it well. One evening, as he sat in the living room watching her move silently around the house, a thought struck him. Perhaps she wasn't as ordinary as he had assumed. Perhaps there was more to her than met the eye. And, for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of curiosity. Not about the world outside, but about the person who lived and worked under his roof. That curiosity quickly turned into a challenge in his mind. He wondered, could I test her? Could I find out how clever she really is? He spent the next few days planning. He thought of small ways to see if she would slip up or show her true nature. He imagined situations where she might make a mistake or reveal that she wasn't as loyal as she seemed. He wasn't cruel, at least he told himself he wasn't, but he wanted to test her boundaries. He wanted to see if he could catch her off guard. The plan seemed simple at first. He would ask her to carry out a task that had hidden difficulties, something that wasn't part of her usual routine. He would watch quietly and see if she could manage it without error. If she failed, he would have his answer. If she succeeded, well, that would surprise him, but he was certain it wouldn't happen. After all, he had always been good at reading people, and he had never been wrong. On the day he decided to begin his little experiment, he felt a strange mix of excitement and confidence. He called her into the living room in a casual tone, making it seem like an ordinary instruction. "Could you take care of this for me?" he asked, holding out a small envelope. It looked ordinary enough, but inside were instructions that weren't entirely straightforward. Some details were vague, and some steps contradicted others. Only someone who paid very close attention, and who had the patience to think things through, could get it right. She took the envelope without a word, nodding politely. She didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate, didn't give any indication that she sensed anything unusual. He watched her as she walked away, thinking that she would fumble at some point. He imagined her scratching her head, looking confused, maybe even asking him for clarification, but she didn't. As the hours passed, he found himself checking on her more than he had planned. At first, it was under the guise of curiosity, but soon it became a silent contest in his mind, a game he couldn't stop playing. He watched as she moved around the house, methodically handling each step of the task. She paused occasionally, as if considering something carefully but never lost focus. He felt a rising frustration. How could she remain so composed, so perfectly on track when the instructions were deliberately confusing? By the evening, the task was complete. He approached her with the envelope, expecting some sign of struggle, a tiny mistake he could point out. But she handed it back to him with a calm, polite smile. The envelope was neat. The instructions were followed precisely, and nothing had been overlooked. He stared at her, feeling a mix of disbelief and admiration. He had expected to find a flaw, a momentary lapse, something that would reveal her to be ordinary, but there was nothing. She had handled it all flawlessly, without complaint, without hesitation. For the first time, he saw her in a new light. She wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just someone who followed orders. She was smart, perceptive, and capable of handling challenges he hadn't thought she could, and yet she had done it all quietly, without any need for recognition or praise. She didn't seek to prove herself. She simply did what was necessary and did it well. He felt an unfamiliar emotion stirring inside him, respect. It was strange and slightly uncomfortable. He had always prided himself on being in control, on understanding people, on being the one who could predict actions and reactions. But here was someone who had completely surprised him. She had turned the table without even realizing it. In his mind, he had set a trap to test her, but she had moved through it effortlessly, showing skill, patience, and intelligence he hadn't anticipated. As he sat in his chair, staring at her as she continued with her chores, he realized that he had learned something important. He had thought he could measure her loyalty, her cleverness, and her character with a simple test. But character, he now understood, wasn't something that could be tested with tricks or challenges. It revealed itself in quiet moments, in how someone acts when they are not being watched or judged, in the integrity with which they approach their work and their life. That night, he lay in bed thinking about her. He thought about the confidence with which she had handled his little experiment, the calmness in her eyes and the subtle wisdom in her actions. He realized he had been arrogant to assume he could test her, that he could somehow see through her. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had learned a lesson in humility. It was a simple lesson, but a powerful one. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that respect could not be demanded, it could not be forced, and it certainly could not be tested with manipulation. Respect had to be earned, and it revealed itself naturally through actions. He had tried to force the answer, and in doing so, he had been surprised. But it was a pleasant surprise, one that made him feel both humbled and enlightened. From that day forward, he looked at her differently. He no longer saw her as just the maid who maintained the house. He saw her as a person with intelligence, insight, and strength. He found himself paying attention in a new way, listening more, observing more, and judging less. And quietly in his own mind, he promised that he would never underestimate her again. The night ended quietly, the house calm and peaceful as always. But inside him, something had shifted. He had set out to test her, to see if he could catch her off guard, and in the process, he had been tested himself. And unlike him, she had passed effortlessly, without knowing she was even part of a challenge. It was a lesson he would not forget, a reminder that sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones who have the most to teach us. The next morning, he woke up feeling a strange mix of curiosity and restlessness. Even after the small experiment the day before, he couldn't stop thinking about her. Her calmness, the quiet confidence with which she handled the task, and the way she seemed to understand exactly what was needed, all of it lingered in his mind. It wasn't just her efficiency that surprised him. It was the intelligence and patience she displayed while carrying out something he had assumed would confuse her. As he went about his morning routine, he watched her from a distance. She moved around the house silently, carrying out tasks that seemed simple at first glance but were actually quite complex. She arranged the breakfast table just so, checked the pantry to make sure everything was in order, and even noticed a small leak in the kitchen sink before it could become a problem. She never made a fuss, never asked for help, and never called attention to herself. He found himself marveling at her without realizing it. The thought came to him again. Perhaps he could learn something more from her. Perhaps she was not just smart but also wise in ways he had not noticed. He realized that he had only scratched the surface of understanding her. The challenge he had set yesterday had been small, almost childish compared to what he could imagine now. If he wanted to truly understand her, he would need to be more careful and observant and maybe even a little creative. He decided to plan a second test, but this time it would be less obvious. Yesterday had been a simple task with hidden difficulties, and she had passed with flying colors. Today, he thought, he would see how she handled unexpected challenges, situations that required not just intelligence but quick thinking and judgment. He didn't want to embarrass her or put her in harm's way. He only wanted to see how she reacted when faced with something unusual. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. During breakfast, he casually mentioned that he needed a small errand done outside the house. He handed her a list of things to buy, but on purpose he included a few items that didn't exist in the stores he usually visited. He watched her face carefully as she read the list. She didn't frown or hesitate. Instead, she nodded politely, folded the list neatly, and said, "I'll get everything you need." He felt a small thrill of anticipation. This time, He would be watching not just from a distance but closely, trying to see how she solved the problem of items that didn't exist. Would she ask questions? Would she improvise? Would she make a mistake? He didn't need to admit it, but deep down he wanted to see her fail just a little, so he could feel his own cleverness validated. She left the house quietly, and he decided to follow, keeping a discreet distance. He watched as she went from shop to shop, asking politely about the items on the list. When she came to one of the items that didn't exist, he expected her to hesitate, to show some confusion, maybe even come back empty-handed, but she didn't. She smiled at the shopkeeper, asked a few questions, and then carefully chose a substitute, something that matched the purpose of the item perfectly. She did this with such subtlety that no one else would notice anything unusual. He was astonished. Not only had she found a solution to a problem he assumed would trip her up, but she had done it quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. She hadn't panicked, she hadn't complained, and she certainly hadn't made a mistake. She had simply used her judgment and common sense, and in doing so, she had turned his little test into a display of her remarkable skill. As she returned home, he thought about the implications. He had assumed that testing her would prove his point, that he could understand people and predict their behavior. But every time he tried, she surprised him. She wasn't just following instructions. She was thinking for herself, anticipating problems and solving them before they became issues. He realized reluctantly that he had underestimated her again. When she handed him the items from the list, he couldn't help but examine each one. Everything was perfect. Even the substitutes for the non-existent items were clever, useful, and exactly what he needed. He felt a small twinge of humility. Here he was, trying to test her, and yet she had outsmarted him without even knowing it. He decided to speak to her directly, not as a superior testing a subordinate, but as someone genuinely curious. "How did you know what to choose for these?" he asked, holding up one of the items. He wasn't trying to sound impressed. He wanted to see her reaction, to find any hint of nervousness or hesitation. She smiled gently and replied, "I thought about what you usually need. If the original item wasn't available, I chose something that would work just as well." Her tone was calm, simple, and unassuming. There was no hint of arrogance or pride. She had explained her thought process clearly, honestly, and without trying to impress him. He nodded slowly, feeling a strange respect growing inside him. It wasn't just her intelligence that impressed him. It was her humility, her thoughtfulness, and her integrity. She didn't boast, she didn't manipulate, she didn't try to gain favor. She simply did her work with care and intelligence, quietly and efficiently. For the rest of the day, he watched her as she moved around the house. Every small action she took now seemed meaningful. The way she arranged the books on the shelf, the way she noticed the small details that no one else would, the way she handled even the simplest tasks with care. It all seemed like a reflection of her character. And he realized slowly that character couldn't be tested with tricks or challenges. It revealed itself naturally, in the way a person approached life and work when no one was watching. He began to think about the lessons he could learn from her. She wasn't just a maid. She was a person with insight, patience, and intelligence. He realized that he had been arrogant in assuming he could test her, that he could somehow predict her actions or catch her in a mistake. She had already shown him that life wasn't about clever tricks or manipulations. It was about understanding, observing, and appreciating the people around you. That evening, he found himself reflecting on the day. He had tried to challenge her, to see if he could outsmart her, and once again he had been surprised. But this time, the surprise wasn't just about her skills, it was about himself. He realized how quick he had been to judge, how eager he had been to assume he knew everything about people, and how little he had actually understood. She had taught him a quiet lesson in humility, patience, and respect. He watched her finish her chores, moving quietly from one task to another. There was no rush, no complaints, no desire for recognition. She simply worked, and in her work, she revealed a strength and intelligence he had never expected. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that understanding a person wasn't about setting tests or challenges. It was about observing, listening, and appreciating their natural abilities and character. For the first time, he felt a deep respect for someone he had previously considered just an employee. He saw her not as someone beneath him, but as a person equal in intelligence and insight. And in that realization, he felt a shift inside himself, a change in how he saw people, how he approached relationships, and how he understood the value of quiet strength. That night, he lay awake thinking about her, about the way she had handled his subtle challenges, and about the lessons he had learned. He realized that respect couldn't be forced, that loyalty couldn't be tested with tricks, and that true understanding came from observation and appreciation, not manipulation. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a quiet gratitude. She had taught him more in one day than he had learned in years about people and character. He had set out to test her, but in the end, he had been the one tested, and he had failed in the most enlightening way possible. The next morning, he woke up with the same quiet curiosity buzzing in his mind. Yesterday's events still lingered, like a gentle echo reminding him of something he hadn't realized before. She was not just competent, she was exceptional. And yet he couldn't shake the desire to understand her even more. It wasn't just curiosity about her intelligence. It was curiosity about her character, her judgment, her way of thinking. He wanted to see how she would respond in a situation that required more than just following instructions. He spent some time in the living room, sipping his coffee and thinking carefully. He didn't want to create another task that felt like a trick. He had already learned that she could handle that with ease. No, this time he wanted to see her adapt to something unexpected, something that would reveal her instinct, patience, and thoughtfulness without being unfair. He wanted to see how she thought on her feet, how she made decisions, and how she treated others while doing so. He found his opportunity sooner than he expected. The postman arrived with a package for him, but he realized it was slightly damaged. Some of the contents inside seemed fragile and potentially broken. He could have just taken care of it himself, but instead, he decided to involve her. He called her over with a casual tone. "Could you handle this for me? Make sure everything inside is okay before I open it." She nodded politely, as she always did, and started examining the package carefully. He watched her from a distance, expecting her to either fumble with it or show some sign of nervousness. But she didn't. She opened the package slowly, handled each item delicately, and inspected everything carefully. One small item was chipped slightly on the edge. She noticed it immediately, setting it aside with a quiet frown but without a hint of panic. He approached her, expecting her to turn red or fumble an explanation. Instead, she looked up calmly and said, "This one has a small chip. The rest are fine. Would you like me to keep it separate?" Her tone was neutral, polite, and matter-of-fact. There was no hesitation, no excuse, no unnecessary explanation, just clarity and honesty. He felt a small twinge of surprise. He had expected her to either overlook the problem or to hesitate. Instead, she had not only noticed it but handled it with confidence. She had made a decision quickly and presented it to him in a simple, straightforward manner. He realized again that he had underestimated her, and a quiet respect began to grow inside him. As the day progressed, he couldn't help but observe her more closely. She moved through the house efficiently, quietly but with careful attention to detail. When a vase tipped slightly on the table, she steadied it without making a big deal. When the kettle started boiling over, she caught it just in time and cleaned up the mess calmly. Everything she did showed focus, patience, and foresight. And yet she didn't make him feel watched or judged. She simply acted responsibly, gracefully, and intelligently. By the afternoon, he realized that if he wanted to see more of her true character, he would need to set a challenge that involved not just tasks but interactions. He wanted to see how she responded to people, how she handled small social pressures, and how she managed situations that required both tact and decision-making. It didn't take long for an opportunity to appear. A neighbor arrived unexpectedly with a minor complaint about the noise from the house. He could have dealt with it himself, but instead he gestured to her. "Could you talk to them? Make sure everything is okay." She didn't hesitate. She smiled gently and walked over to the neighbor's door. He watched from a distance, curious about how she would handle the situation. The neighbor began explaining the problem, clearly frustrated. Most people might have become defensive or argumentative, but she listened carefully, nodded thoughtfully, and responded with calm assurance. She didn't argue, she didn't dismiss the concern, and she didn't blame anyone. She offered a solution that addressed the issue immediately, while also explaining politely that she would make sure it didn't happen again. He was impressed, not just because she had solved the problem, but because she had done it with empathy and intelligence. She had not only managed the task, but she had also maintained a positive relationship with someone who might otherwise have been upset. She had shown understanding, patience, and tact, all without needing praise or recognition. By evening, he found himself reflecting deeply on her actions. Every small task she did, every interaction she handled revealed something about her character. He had started out thinking he could test her, think he could trick her into revealing something hidden, but with every passing hour he realized that the lessons weren't about her, they were about him. He had assumed he could measure her intelligence, predict her actions, and even manipulate the situation. Yet she had consistently surprised him, taught him patience, and forced him to rethink his assumptions. He felt a mixture of humility and admiration. He had always thought he understood people, had always relied on his own judgment and instincts, but she had quietly shown him that true understanding comes from observation, empathy, and respect, not from testing, tricking, or judging. She had handled every challenge with quiet confidence, integrity, and thoughtfulness. That evening, he decided to speak to her directly. He didn't know exactly what he would say, but he wanted to acknowledge something, to express at least a fraction of the respect he now felt. "You handled today very well," he said, carefully, unsure of the right words. She looked at him with a calm, polite smile. "I just did what I thought was right," she replied simply. No pride, no exaggeration, no attempt to impress, just honesty. He nodded, realizing that her humility was just as remarkable as her intelligence. She didn't seek to dominate or control. She didn't try to prove herself, and she didn't need recognition. She simply acted with awareness, responsibility, and care. That night, he lay awake thinking about her. He realized that he had been approaching her the wrong way all along. He had thought he could test her to see who she really was, but he was starting to understand that her character wasn't something that could be revealed through tricks or challenges. It was visible in the way she lived her life, handled her work, and interacted with others. And he had been blind to it for years, assuming she was ordinary simply because she didn't flaunt her abilities. He felt a quiet gratitude, though he didn't admit it to anyone. She had shown him a side of life he hadn't considered before, a side that valued observation, patience, empathy, and quiet strength. And he realized that the true test, if there was one, wasn't for her at all. The true test was for him. Could he see her clearly, respect her fully, and learn from her without judgment or expectation? As he drifted off to sleep, he made a promise to himself. He wouldn't try to test her again in the same way. He wouldn't set traps or challenges to measure her abilities. Instead, he would watch, listen, and learn. He had come to understand that life and character were not about clever tricks or manipulations. They were about integrity, patience, and quiet intelligence. And in that quiet moment, he finally understood something important. Sometimes, the people we think we know the least are the ones who teach us the most. She hadn't just handled his little tests. She had opened his eyes to something bigger. She had reminded him that true respect, true understanding, and true admiration are earned through actions, not assumptions. For the first time, he felt that he wasn't trying to control or measure someone else. He was learning, growing, and understanding, and it was all because of her. The night passed peacefully, but he knew that things had changed. He no longer saw her as just the maid who kept the house running. He saw her as a person with intelligence, judgment, and quiet strength. And in seeing her clearly, he began to see himself more clearly as well. A man who had learned that life isn't about testing others, but about appreciating them. The next morning, he woke up with a restless feeling he hadn't experienced before. He had spent the previous days observing her, seeing her handle challenges and quietly teaching him lessons about patience, intelligence, and character. But even with all of that, there was one thing he still wanted to know: what she thought of him. He realized almost reluctantly that his curiosity had shifted. It was no longer about testing her skills or seeing if she could be tricked. Now he wanted to understand her perspective, her honesty, and her insight. For hours he hesitated, thinking about how to approach her. He didn't want to sound accusatory or intrusive. He didn't want to seem patronizing. He simply wanted to ask in a sincere way if she had noticed his little experiments, his subtle tests, and what she thought about them. He realized that asking this question would reveal not just her wisdom, but also her sense of character and empathy. Finally, he gathered his courage. He found her in the kitchen, quietly arranging the utensils after breakfast. She looked up and smiled politely as she always did, unaware of the turmoil in his mind. He cleared his throat, unsure how to begin. I need to be honest with you, he said slowly. I've been trying to test you over the past few days. For a moment, he expected a reaction of surprise, irritation, or perhaps embarrassment, but she didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't seem shocked. She simply paused, looked at him calmly, and waited for him to continue. He felt a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. I thought I could understand you better by seeing how you handle little challenges. I wanted to see if you would make mistakes, if you would panic, if you would... He trailed off, unsure how to explain his feelings. She listened quietly, her expression neutral, giving him the space to speak. Then after a moment, she said simply, I noticed. He blinked, not quite expecting her to admit it. You noticed? He asked, his voice tinged with surprise. Yes, she replied calmly. I noticed that some tasks were unusual, that some requests didn't seem normal, but I didn't see them as tests. I just treated them as part of my work. I thought carefully, acted honestly, and tried to do what I thought was best. That's all. Her words struck him. She hadn't criticized him, she hadn't judged him, and she hadn't tried to manipulate the situation. She had seen through his subtle tests, but had treated them with calm understanding. She hadn't made him feel foolish, but her honesty revealed the truth he had been avoiding. She had been aware all along. He realized then that she had handled the situation far better than he had imagined. She had not reacted out of fear, pride, or desire to impress. She had reacted out of integrity, common sense, and respect. For him, for herself, and for the work she was doing. He felt a wave of humility wash over him. He wanted to say something, anything that could convey the respect he suddenly felt. I didn't expect you to notice, he admitted quietly. I thought I was clever, that I could test you without you realizing it. But you've surprised me again, she gave a small, polite smile. I didn't see it as surprising. I just saw it as life. People sometimes create situations that aren't ordinary. I try to respond thoughtfully, honestly, and calmly. That's all I've ever done, he paused, letting her words sink in. There was no arrogance, no pretension, no attempt to teach him a lesson. She simply spoke the truth in a way that made him feel both ashamed and enlightened. He realized that all the subtle tests, the little challenges, the clever tricks he had set up, they hadn't proven anything about her. They had only revealed his own assumptions, insecurities, and misunderstandings. Over the next few hours, he watched her work with renewed attention. Every movement, every choice, every interaction seemed to carry a quiet purpose. When she prepared lunch, she didn't rush. She measured carefully, tasted thoughtfully, and adjusted with care. When she tidied the living room, she didn't just arrange things neatly. She considered how others might use the space, how it could be most comfortable, and how it could create a pleasant environment. He realized something profound. She didn't just perform tasks, she considered their impact, their meaning, and the feelings of others. She didn't act for recognition or approval. She acted because it was the right thing to do. And in that, he saw a strength and wisdom that he had never encountered before. Later in the afternoon, he decided to take another quiet test, not to trick her, but to see how she handled something unexpected in a social situation. A friend dropped by unexpectedly, someone who could be critical and impatient. Normally, he would have handled the interaction himself, but he gestured to her and said, "Would you please make them comfortable?" She nodded and greeted the visitor with calm friendliness. When the visitor began to complain about a minor inconvenience, she didn't interrupt, defend herself, or dismiss the concern. She listened carefully, acknowledged the complaint, and offered a solution without hesitation. By the time the visitor left, they were smiling, satisfied, and clearly impressed with her calm, thoughtful approach. He sat quietly, observing her, feeling more respect than he had ever felt before. It wasn't just her intelligence that impressed him. It was her character, her patience, her empathy, and her ability to respond to challenges without ego or fear. She had turned every small test into an opportunity to demonstrate her integrity, and in doing so, she had taught him a lesson he couldn't ignore. That evening, he found himself reflecting deeply. He realized that he had been approaching her the wrong way all along. He had tried to test her, to set challenges, to observe how she would react. But her actions had shown him that character, Wisdom and true intelligence could not be tested with tricks. They were revealed through patience, honesty, and thoughtful behavior. He understood finally that the real lesson wasn't about her, it was about him. He had assumed he could control situations, manipulate outcomes, and measure someone's worth through clever tests. She had quietly shown him that true understanding comes from observation, humility, and respect. As he sat in silence watching her prepare dinner, he felt a shift in his perspective. He no longer saw her as someone to test or measure. He saw her as a teacher, not in the formal sense, but in the way her actions and character revealed truths about life, integrity, and human understanding. Later that night, he found himself thinking about everything that had happened over the past few days. He realized that he had been blind to her qualities, assuming that because she didn't boast or seek recognition, she was ordinary. But she had proven time and again that true strength and intelligence are quiet, consistent, and honest. For the first time, he felt genuine humility. He understood that he had much to learn, not from books, not from clever schemes, but from observing, listening, and appreciating the people around him. She had not just passed his tests. She had elevated him, challenged him to think differently, and inspired him to grow. He realized that life was full of lessons, and that the people we often overlook may hold the most important truths. She had shown him that respect, understanding, and admiration are earned through action, integrity, and quiet thoughtfulness. And in that realization, he felt a deep gratitude, though he didn't speak it aloud. As he drifted off to sleep, he made a silent promise to himself. He would no longer try to trick or test her. He would observe, learn, and grow. He would see her clearly, appreciate her fully, and let her actions continue to teach him without interference. For the first time, he understood something he had never considered. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from those we least expect, and sometimes, the person we think we are testing is the one teaching us the most profound truths about life, character, and respect. The following morning began like any other, with the soft hum of the house and the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea. He woke up with a quiet determination. After the events of the last few days, he knew that he could no longer approach her as someone to test or trick. Her intelligence, patience, and quiet strength had become clear to him. What he wanted now was something different. He wanted honesty, a chance to understand her heart, her perspective, and the wisdom she had shown in every action. As he watched her move through the house, tidying the rooms and organizing things with careful attention, he realized that she had a rhythm to her work that was almost calming. She never hurried, never complained, and never demanded recognition. Everything she did was done thoughtfully and with care. He understood now that her strength didn't come from loud displays of skill. It came from consistency, mindfulness, and integrity. Finally, gathering his courage, he decided it was time to speak openly. He approached her while she was arranging some fresh flowers in the living room. She looked up, smiling politely as always, and gave him a gentle nod, sensing that something was different in his demeanor. He took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "I want to apologize for the way I've behaved the past few days. I realize now that I treated you unfairly, trying to test you instead of trusting you." For a moment, he expected her to respond with annoyance, or perhaps to offer reassurance that he had done nothing wrong. But instead, she studied him quietly, her eyes calm and attentive. Then she said, "I've noticed, and I understand why you did it. But you didn't need to test me. I was doing my job and I acted the way I thought was right." Her words carried no resentment, no accusation, just honesty. He felt a wave of humility wash over him. She had seen through his intentions without letting him feel judged, and yet she was able to confront the truth in a gentle way. It was a lesson in courage, patience, and tact all at once. "I think I underestimated you," he admitted, his voice tinged with sincerity. "I assumed I could predict your actions or measure your character with little challenges. But you've proven me wrong every single time." She nodded calmly. "It's not about proving anyone wrong. It's about doing what's right and being honest and thoughtful in every situation." He realized that she wasn't just talking about the tasks she had completed. She was sharing a philosophy of life. Her words, simple as they were, carried a profound truth. He had spent years thinking he understood people, thinking he could measure intelligence and character through observation and cleverness. But she had quietly shown him that true wisdom isn't measured by tests or tricks. It is lived through everyday choices, actions, and honesty. He felt a deep sense of respect, almost awe. Her humility, her quiet strength, and her thoughtful approach to life made him reconsider everything he had assumed about intelligence, responsibility, and trust. It was clear now that she didn't need validation from anyone because her actions spoke louder than words ever could. "Can I ask you something?" he said hesitantly. "Of course," she replied, her tone calm and open. "Did you ever feel offended by my tests? Or frustrated with me?" She paused, then smiled gently. "Not really. I understood your intentions. I could see that you were curious, maybe even a little unsure of how to trust, but I never let it affect me. I just focused on doing what I believed was right. Life is too short to waste energy on frustration." Her response surprised him, not because it was unexpected, but because it revealed a depth of character he hadn't fully appreciated until now. She had faced his subtle manipulations, his little tests, and even his unspoken doubts, and she had responded not with anger or pride, but with patience, clarity, and thoughtfulness. He sat down, feeling both humbled and enlightened. For the first time, he understood that people reveal their true selves not through conflict or clever challenges, but through consistent, quiet choices. He had been so focused on testing her that he had almost missed the lessons she was offering freely every day. "Thank you," he said quietly, "not just for dealing with my foolishness, but for showing me how to see clearly. I've learned more from you in these few days than I have from anyone else in years." She nodded, a small, polite smile on her face. "I don't do it to teach. I do it because it feels right. But if it helps you see things differently, I'm glad." He realized that her strength wasn't just in intelligence or skill, it was in her integrity, patience, and the ability to act with clarity, even when situations were unusual or challenging. Every small action she had taken, from handling a broken package to calming an irate neighbor, had been a reflection of her thoughtful nature. And now, after everything, he finally understood it fully. The rest of the day passed quietly but with a different energy. He noticed her work in a new way, not as tasks being completed but as lessons being demonstrated. When she prepared dinner, she moved with care and attention, tasting and adjusting with precision. When she arranged the living room, she considered comfort, aesthetics, and practicality simultaneously. Every small act was deliberate, thoughtful, and meaningful. In the evening, he decided to take a walk outside to clear his mind. As he walked through the garden, he reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that his desire to test her had been a reflection of his own insecurity, not her capabilities.
He had assumed he could judge her character, but in reality,
he had been learning a lesson about himself, the value of humility, observation, and respect. When he returned, he found her quietly sitting in the kitchen, reading a book while sipping tea. She looked up as he entered, smiling politely. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, smiling back, though a little awkwardly. "Everything is better than okay. I've learned something important. About life, about people, and about myself." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's good. Sometimes we learn the most from everyday moments, even from things that seem small." He realized she was right. The tests he had tried to set were small in comparison to the lessons she had taught him, simply by living her life with honesty, patience, and care. He felt gratitude, humility, and a quiet sense of wonder. For the first time, he truly saw her, not just as someone who helped around the house, but as a person of remarkable character and wisdom. And he understood that these qualities could not be forced, tested, or judged. They could only be recognized and respected. As night fell, he reflected on the journey of the past few days. He had entered the situation with a desire to test her, to see her true self. But in reality, it was he who had been tested by his own assumptions, his impatience, and his need to control. And in every instance, she had responded with clarity, patience, and integrity, showing him a better way to see the world and the people in it. He realized that the greatest lesson wasn't about skill, intelligence, or cleverness. It was about respect, humility, and understanding. She had shown him that true character is revealed not in what someone can do, but in how they approach life with honesty, care, and consistency. By the end of the evening, he felt a profound sense of change. He knew that he could never approach someone with the mindset of testing them again. He had learned that human beings reveal their value not through challenges or tricks, but through integrity, patience, and thoughtful action. Before going to bed, he quietly said to himself, "I understand now. I was trying to test someone extraordinary without realizing it. And in the process, I've learned to see clearly, to respect fully, and to grow." She didn't need to hear these words. Her actions had already spoken louder than any explanation could, and as he lay down to sleep, he felt a sense of peace, gratitude, and humility he hadn't felt before. He had entered the situation thinking he could measure her, but he left it having learned something far more valuable: the true meaning of respect, integrity, and human understanding. The next morning, life continued as usual, but nothing felt the same. Every small action, every thoughtful gesture, every quiet moment of care now held meaning. He had come to realize that extraordinary people often live quietly, without recognition or applause, and that the greatest lessons come from observing and appreciating them. And in that quiet everyday life, he found something remarkable. He had discovered not only her true nature, but also a better understanding of himself. The person he had tried to test had, in truth, taught him more than he could have imagined.